In the scorching summer of 1873, when the Arizona Territory was still a land where bullets spoke louder than words, a simple act of kindness would reshape the destiny of 3 lives forever. This is not a tale of conquest or glory, but of an ordinary man whose heart proved bigger than his fear, and how 2 young Apache women and their powerful chief would transform a struggling cattle rancher into something he never imagined he could become. What started as a chance encounter near a dried riverbed would spiral into a web of danger, honor, and impossible choices that would test the very limits of human courage. Sometimes, the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary people doing what they believe is right, even when the whole world tells them they're wrong. This is the true story of how compassion became a bridge between 2 worlds at war, and how one man's simple act of mercy would echo through generations, changing not just his own fate, but the course of history in the American Southwest. Thomas Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse along the dried creek bed that used to run clear and cold through his property. The summer of 1873 had been merciless to the Arizona Territory, turning once fertile pastures into cracked earth that crunched under his horse's hooves like broken pottery. His cattle, what few remained after the drought and recent Apache raids, huddled in whatever shade they could find near the dying cottonwoods. At 32 years old, Thomas had already lived through more hardship than most men see in a lifetime. He'd lost his wife Sarah to cholera 2 years prior, and their dreams of building a prosperous ranch in this harsh but beautiful land seemed to crumble a little more each day. The other settlers in the area had either given up and headed back east, or armed themselves to the teeth and joined the local militia that hunted Apache bands with the fury of men who had lost everything. But Thomas was different. Maybe it was the way Sarah had taught him to see the humanity in everyone, or maybe it was just his stubborn Irish nature, but he refused to let hatred consume what was left of his heart. Even as his neighbors spoke of the Apache as nothing more than savage animals to be exterminated, Thomas remembered the faces of the Apache families he'd occasionally seen at a distance, peaceful faces that looked remarkably similar to his own when worry and hunger had worn them thin. As his horse picked its way carefully along the rocky creek bed, Thomas noticed something unusual ahead. At first, he thought it might be a fallen log or a cluster of rocks, but as he drew closer, his heart began to race. 2 figures lay motionless beside what had once been a small pool of water, now reduced to nothing more than cracked mud and a few stagnant puddles. They were young women, clearly Apache by their dress and the intricate beadwork on their deerskin clothing. One appeared to be in her early 20s, with long black hair braided with small turquoise stones. The other was younger, perhaps 16, and bore a striking resemblance to her companion. Sisters, Thomas realized. Both were unconscious, their lips cracked and skin flushed with the telltale signs of severe dehydration. For a moment, Thomas sat frozen in his saddle. Every practical instinct screamed at him to ride away. These could be scouts or bait for an ambush. The Apache were known for their cunning warfare tactics, and more than one settler had met his end by stopping to help what appeared to be a helpless victim. His neighbors would call him a fool, and they might be right. But, as he looked at the 2 young women, he saw something that made his decision for him. The younger sister's hand was clutched protectively around a small bundle of baby's rattle made from a gourd and decorated with tiny shells. It was the kind of thing Sarah might have made for their own child, if they'd been blessed with one. These weren't warriors lying in wait. They were daughters, perhaps mothers themselves, dying slowly under the merciless sun. Thomas dismounted and approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt revolver, not out of aggression but simple caution. Up close, he could see that both women were breathing, but barely. Their water containers, beautifully crafted from animal hide, lay empty beside them. He knelt down and gently shook the older sister's shoulder. "Miss? Can you hear me?" The young woman's eyes fluttered open, dark and intelligent despite her weakened condition. When she saw Thomas, a white man kneeling over her, fear flashed across her features. She tried to sit up, to shield her younger sister, but she was too weak. Her hand moved instinctively toward a knife at her belt, but the gesture was feeble and desperate rather than threatening. "Easy now," Thomas said softly, showing his empty hands. "I'm not here to hurt you. You need water." The woman stared at him with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Thomas quickly returned to his horse and retrieved his canteen, which was still half full with precious water he'd been rationing for his journey back to town. When he returned to the women, the older sister had managed to prop herself up slightly. She watched warily as Thomas uncapped his canteen and held it out to her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she reached out and accepted the water. She took a small sip first, testing whether it was truly water or something else, then drank more deeply. After a few swallows, she pulled the canteen away and began gently lifting her sister's head, dripping water between the younger woman's parched lips. As the immediate crisis of dehydration began to ease, Thomas found himself studying the two women more closely. Their clothing was finely made, decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of skill and patience. The older sister wore a necklace of silver and turquoise that looked like ceremonial jewelry, not everyday wear. These weren't just any Apache women, these were clearly from a family of some importance. The younger sister's eyes opened as the water began to revive her. She looked first at her sister, then at Thomas, and her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. She spoke rapidly in Apache to her sister, and, though Thomas couldn't understand the words, her tone was unmistakably one of warning and fear. The older sister responded calmly, gesturing toward the empty canteen in Thomas's hand. She seemed to be explaining what had happened, how this white stranger had given them water when they were dying. The younger sister's expression softened slightly, but suspicion remained in her dark eyes. Thomas knew he was at a crossroads. He could leave them here with the water and hope they had the strength to make it to safety, or he could risk everything by offering more substantial help. The rational part of his mind reminded him that harboring Apache fugitives could get him killed by both sides in this conflict. But, as he looked at the two sisters, he thought again of Sarah and what she would have done. "My ranch isn't far," he said, knowing they probably couldn't understand his English but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "You can rest there, get your strength back." The older sister studied his face for a long moment, then spoke in careful, heavily accented English. "Why you help us? Your people, they want us dead." Her ability to speak his language surprised Thomas, but it also made the conversation more dangerous. If she spoke English, she might have had contact with soldiers or settlers before. She might know things about planned attacks or troop movements that could make helping her an act of treason. "Because it's the right thing to do," Thomas replied simply. "My name is Thomas Mackenzie. This is my land you're on, and, as long as you're here, you're under my protection." The woman's eyes widened at his words. In Apache culture, such a declaration was not made lightly. To offer protection meant accepting responsibility for their lives, potentially at the cost of his own. "I am Ayana," she said quietly. "This is my sister, Seetlali. We are daughters of Chief Nailnish." Thomas felt his blood run cold. Chief Nailnish was one of the most respected and feared Apache leaders in the territory. His raids had driven dozens of families from their homesteads, and the army had placed a substantial bounty on his head. These weren't just any Apache women, they were the chief's daughters. Helping them could be seen as an act of war against the United States government. But it was too late to turn back now. He'd already made his choice the moment he'd offered them water. "Can you ride?" he asked. Ayana nodded slowly. "With help." Thomas helped both sisters to their feet, supporting them as they walked to his horse. The younger sister, Seetlali, was still too weak to ride alone, so Thomas lifted her onto his horse first, then helped Ayana mount behind her. He would have to walk and lead the horse, but his ranch was only about 2 miles away. As they began the slow journey across the sun-baked landscape, Thomas found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He was harboring the daughters of an Apache war chief during one of the bloodiest periods in the territory's history. If his neighbors discovered what he was doing, they'd likely shoot him as a traitor before asking questions. If the army found out, he could face court-martial and execution. But, as he walked beside his horse, listening to the soft conversation between the two sisters in their musical Apache language, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was doing something that felt truly meaningful. He was saving lives rather than taking them, building bridges rather than walls. The sun was beginning to set by the time they reached Thomas's small ranch house. It wasn't much, a modest adobe structure with a tile roof and a small garden that had somehow managed to survive the drought thanks to a nearby natural spring. His barn and corrals housed his remaining cattle, and a windmill creaked slowly in the evening breeze, drawing water from the deep well he'd dug his first year here. As he helped the sisters down from his horse, Thomas noticed how carefully they observed everything around them. They were taking note of his defenses, the layout of his property, the condition of his livestock. It was an automatic survival response, he realized. In their world, such information could mean the difference between life and death. Inside the modest house, Thomas lit an oil lamp and gestured for the women to sit at his simple wooden table. The main room was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of handmade furniture, and a shelf lined with books that had belonged to Sarah. A photograph of Thomas and his late wife sat on the mantel, the only decoration in the otherwise utilitarian space. Thomas prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and what little bacon he had left in his stores. As the sisters ate, their strength gradually returned, and he found himself actually having a conversation with Ayanna. Her English was better than he'd initially realized, learned from a missionary who had briefly worked with their tribe before being driven away by the army. "Why you live here alone?" Ayanna asked, noticing the woman's clothing still hanging in the bedroom and the too neat arrangement of everything that spoke of a man trying to maintain a home that had been designed for two people. "My wife died 2 years ago," Thomas said simply. "Cholera." Ayanna nodded, understanding passing between them. Death was something both their peoples knew intimately. "You have children?" "No. We wanted them, but..." Thomas trailed off, then looked at her directly. "Do you?" "Children, I mean." "Not yet. But, Seedlali, she has young son. He is with our grandmother while we were." She paused, clearly debating how much to reveal. "While you were scouting for your father?" Thomas asked gently. Ayanna's hand moved instinctively toward her knife again, then stopped. If this man had wanted to harm them, he'd already had plenty of opportunities. "You are not what we expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" "Monster," Seedlali spoke for the first time, her voice still hoarse but determined. Her English was more limited than her sister's, but the word came out clearly enough. Thomas nodded slowly. "And what do I expect from you?" The sisters exchanged glances. "Same," Ayanna admitted. As the evening wore on and the sisters' strength returned, Thomas began to understand the gravity of his situation. They weren't just refugees fleeing the conflict, they were on a mission. Chief Nailnish had sent his daughters to scout the area for information about army movements and settler defenses. They'd been returning to their camp when the combination of heat, lack of water, and exhaustion had nearly killed them. But something had changed during their time in his house. The way Ayanna looked at him had shifted from suspicion to curiosity, and, finally, to something approaching respect. She asked about his books, about his life before coming to Arizona, about his dreams for the ranch. She told him about her people's traditional ways, about the sacred places in the mountains that the army was systematically destroying, about the children who went to sleep hungry because their hunting grounds had been taken away. When the time came for them to leave, none of them seemed quite ready for the conversation to end. Thomas had given them fresh water, some food for their journey, and even a spare blanket. But, more importantly, he'd given them something neither side in this conflict thought possible, a glimpse of their enemy's humanity. "We will not forget this kindness," Ayanna said as she prepared to mount the horse Thomas was letting them borrow. "But, I cannot promise it will protect you. There are those among my people who would kill you simply for being white, just as there are those among your people who would kill us simply for being Apache." "I understand," Thomas replied. "But, maybe understanding has to start somewhere." As the two sisters rode away into the darkness, heading back toward the mountains where their tribe was camped, Thomas stood in his doorway for a long time, watching until they disappeared completely. He had no idea that his simple act of compassion had set in motion a chain of events that would soon bring Chief Nailnish himself to his door, or that the choice he'd made this day would ultimately determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone he'd come to care about. The drought-stricken land around him looked the same as it had that morning, but Thomas felt as though something fundamental had shifted. He'd crossed a line that most of his neighbors wouldn't even dare approach, and there was no going back. Whatever came next, he'd face it with the knowledge that he'd chosen mercy over fear, understanding over hatred. As he finally went inside and prepared for bed, Thomas found himself thinking about the look in Ayana's eyes when she'd said goodbye. It wasn't the look of an enemy. It was the look of someone who had seen a possibility she hadn't known existed, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was another way forward besides endless war. 3 days passed in an uneasy calm. Thomas went about his daily routine of tending to his remaining cattle, checking the water levels in his well, and trying to coax life from his struggling vegetable garden. But every sound made him look up, every movement in his peripheral vision made his hand drift toward his gun. He kept expecting either soldiers to come demanding answers about harboring Apache fugitives, or Apache warriors to come seeking revenge for some perceived slight. Instead, what came was silence. On the 4th morning, as Thomas was repairing a broken fence post near his eastern pasture, he heard the soft nickering of his borrowed horse returning. He looked up to see the animal walking slowly toward the barn, its reins trailing in the dust. The horse looked tired but unharmed, and tied to the saddle was a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Thomas approached carefully, scanning the horizon for any sign of the sisters or other Apache. The bundle contained dried meat, some kind of ground meal he didn't recognize, and a small piece of silver jewelry intricately carved with symbols he couldn't read. There was also a message, written in careful English on a piece of bark: payment for kindness. You are remembered. He was still examining the gifts when he heard a voice behind him, calm and deep, speaking accented English. My daughters speak truth about you. Thomas spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. Standing not 20 feet away, as if he had materialized from the very earth itself, was a man who could only be Chief Nailnish. He was tall and lean, with graying hair that hung to his shoulders and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore traditional Apache clothing, but Thomas noted the rifle slung across his back and the knife at his belt. Most unsettling of all, the chief was completely alone, as far as Thomas could tell. Chief Nailnish, I presume, Thomas said, proud that his voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. The Apache leader nodded slowly. You know who I am. Yet you do not run. You do not call for soldiers. Interesting. Thomas set down the bundle and straightened to his full height, which was still several inches shorter than the imposing chief. This is my land. I don't run from visitors. Visitors. Nailnish seemed to taste the word. Is that what I am? That depends on why you're here. For a long moment, the two men studied each other in silence. Thomas could see where Ayana had gotten her intelligent eyes and proud bearing. Despite everything he'd heard about this man, his reputation as a fierce warrior, his success in evading the army, the fear he struck in the hearts of settlers, Chief Nailnish carried himself with a dignity that commanded respect rather than terror. You saved my daughters' lives, the chief said finally. I gave them water. Anyone would have done the same. No. Nailnish shook his head firmly. Many of your people would have left them to die. Others would have captured them for the bounty. You did neither. Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he waited. This creates debt, Nailnish continued. In my culture, such debt must be acknowledged. But it also creates questions. Why does White Rancher risk everything to help Apache women? What does he want in return? I didn't want anything in return. I still don't. Everyone wants something. Thomas thought about that for a moment, then nodded. You're right. I do want something. I want to be able to sleep at night knowing I did the right thing. I want to be the kind of man my wife would still be proud of. That's what I wanted in return. Nailnish's expression shifted slightly, and Thomas caught a glimpse of something that might have been approval in the chief's eyes. Your wife. Ayana tells me she is dead. 2 years now. You have not taken another wife. This is unusual for white men in this place. Usually they send east for women like ordering supplies. The observation stung because it was accurate. Several of Thomas's neighbors had indeed sent for mail-order brides after losing their wives to disease, violence, or the simple harshness of frontier life.
Sarah wasn't replaceable, Thomas said simply. Ah. Nailnish nodded as if this explains something important. You understand loss.
This is why you helped my daughters.
You know what it means to watch something precious slip away. Thomas was surprised by the chief's insight. Maybe. I hadn't thought of it that way. You think of it now.
Nailnish walked closer, and Thomas forced himself not to step back.
I come here for 2 reasons. First, to thank you for my daughters' lives. Second, to see what kind of man you are. And, what have you decided?
Instead of answering directly, Nailnish looked around at Thomas's modest ranch. He took in the well-maintained buildings, the healthy cattle despite the drought, the small garden where vegetables grew in neat rows.
You are not rich, man. No. But, you work hard. You build something here. You love this land.
It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway.
Yes. My people, we also love this land. For many generations, we live here. We know every spring, every canyon, every tree. This land is part of us, and we are part of it.
Thomas began to understand where this conversation was heading.
But, now we're here too. Yes. And, your government says we must leave. Go to reservation far from here, far from sacred places of our ancestors. They say this land belongs to white men now.
I didn't ask for your land to be taken, Thomas said quietly.
No. But, you benefit from taking.
Your ranch sits on ground where my grandfather hunted deer. Your well draws from spring my grandmother used to gather medicine plants. The words could have been accusatory, but Nailnish spoke them matter-of-factly, without anger.
He was simply stating the reality of their situation. What would you have me do? Thomas asked. I can't give you back the whole territory. Cannot. Or will not. Thomas considered the question seriously. Both, I suppose. Even if I wanted to give you this land, I couldn't speak for the government or the army or all the other settlers. And, honestly, I've put 2 years of my life into building this place. My wife is buried here. I can't just walk away. Nailnish nodded as if he'd expected this answer. Honest words. Most white men, they lie. They say they want peace while they sharpen knives behind their backs. You speak truth, even when truth is not comfortable. Truth is all I have left, Thomas admitted. Good. Now I tell you truth. My people, we are dying. Not just from bullets and soldiers.
We die from hunger, from sickness, from despair. Children born on reservation, they forget old ways, forget who they are. This is death of different kind, but still death. Thomas felt the weight of the chief's words, the impossible situation that had driven proud people to desperate measures.
What can be done? I do not know. But, I think maybe you are part of answer I have been seeking.
Before Thomas could ask what that meant, Nailnish reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something small and dark. He held it out to Thomas, who saw that it was a piece of black stone, polished smooth and carved with symbols similar to those on the jewelry Ayanna had sent. This is Apache safe passage token, Nailnish explained. Any of my people who see this will know you are under my protection. They will not harm you or your property. Thomas stared at the stone, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. Why would you do this? Because I believe spirits brought my daughters to your land that day. Because I believe you may be bridge between our peoples that prophets speak of in old stories. Because, and here Nailnish's expression became almost gentle, my daughters have not stopped talking about white rancher who treated them like human beings instead of enemies. Thomas accepted the stone, feeling its smooth weight in his palm. This is a great honor. But, it also makes me a target for my own people. Yes. Honor and danger often walk together. You understand this? I understand. Good. Now I make offer that will test whether you truly mean words you speak. Thomas waited, though he had a feeling he wasn't going to like what came next. Winter comes soon.
Game is scarce because white hunters kill for sport, not food.
Plants we gather for medicine, they are destroyed by cattle and plows.
My people, they will be hungry. Some will starve. I'm sorry to hear that. Sorry does not fill empty bellies. But, you have cattle. You have food stores. You have spring that never runs dry even in drought.
Thomas began to see where this was leading.
You want me to share my resources with your people.
I want you to prove that bridge between our peoples can be built with actions, not just words.
The request was staggering in its implications. If Thomas agreed, he'd be actively supporting the very Apache who were considered enemies of the territory.
If word got out, he'd be branded a traitor. The army might arrest him, or worse, his neighbors might take justice into their own hands. He could lose everything he'd worked for. But, if he refused, he'd be proving that his compassion had limits, that when push came to shove, he was just another white settler who drew lines around who deserved help and who didn't.
How many people are we talking about? Thomas asked.
In my band, 37.
12 are children under 10 winters. 8 are elders who can no longer hunt. Thomas did quick calculations in his head.
His food stores were adequate for one person through the winter, but stretched thin if he tried to feed nearly 40 people. His cattle herd could provide some meat, but not enough to sustain everyone.
And if other Apache bands learned what he was doing,
there would have to be rules, Thomas said slowly. I can't have war parties staging raids from my property. I can't harbor stolen goods or weapons taken from other settlers. And this arrangement would have to be secret, at least from the soldiers and most of the other ranchers.
Nailnish considered this.
You ask my people to trust man they have been taught to hate, to hide from those who might help them, to depend on enemy for survival.
You understand what you ask? Do you understand what you're asking of me?
If this goes wrong, we'll all end up dead or worse.
Yes. This is why it is test. Easy choices require no courage.
Thomas looked around at his ranch again, at everything he'd built with Sarah, everything he'd struggled to maintain since her death. He was being asked to risk it all on the chance that compassion could triumph over hatred, that understanding could bridge the gap between two peoples who seemed destined to destroy each other.
I'll need time to think about this, he said finally. How much time?
Give me 3 days. Meet me here at sunset 3 days from now.
I'll have an answer.
Nailnish studied Thomas's face for a long moment, then nodded.
3 days.
But, know this, Thomas Mackenzie, if you agree to this, there is no going back. You will be changed by it, and so will my people.
Some changes cannot be undone. I understand.
As the Apache chief prepared to leave, melting back into the landscape as silently as he'd appeared, he paused and looked back at Thomas.
One more thing. Ayana, she asks about you. She wonders if all white men are like you, or if you are a rare thing.
What did you tell her?
I told her I would find out.
Nailnish smiled slightly, the first time Thomas had seen any softness in the man's stern features. I think perhaps you are indeed rare thing, Thomas Mackenzie.
Question is whether rare is enough.
After the chief disappeared, Thomas stood alone in his yard for a long time, turning the black stone over in his hands and staring at the horizon. 3 days to make a decision that could save lives or end his own. 3 days to choose between safety and service, between the easy path and the right one. As evening fell and he made his simple supper, Thomas found himself thinking about Sarah and what she would have done in his situation. She'd always been braver than he was, more willing to take risks for others. But she'd also been practical, careful not to leap into situations that could harm them both. That night, he barely slept. Every creak of the house settling, every call of a night bird, every whisper of wind through the cottonwoods made him think of Apache warriors moving through the darkness. But they weren't threatening sounds, he realized. They were the sounds of a land that belonged to many people, not just one. The weight of Chief Nailnish's proposal pressed down on him like a physical thing. 37 lives hanging in the balance of his decision. His own future balanced on the edge of a knife. And, somewhere in it all, the possibility that one man's choice could begin to heal wounds that had been festering for generations.
3 days to decide. 3 days to choose his destiny. The 3 days passed like a lifetime. Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. He'd start to repair a fence, then find himself staring into the distance, imagining Apache families huddled in cold mountain caves with empty stomachs. He'd begin to feed his cattle, then stop to calculate how many people he could sustain with his winter stores. Every rational part of his mind screamed that he was considering suicide by generosity, while his conscience whispered that some things mattered more than safety. On the second day, his neighbor Jake Morrison rode over to share news from town. Jake was a good man, but, like most settlers, he viewed the Apache situation in stark terms of us versus them. "Army's offering a bigger bounty now," Jake said as they sat on Thomas's porch, sharing coffee and watching the sunset paint the mountains crimson. $200 for any Apache warrior, dead or alive. $50 for women and children. Thomas's blood ran cold. $50 for children? Hell, Tom, you sound like you disapprove. These ain't regular children. Apache kids grow up to be Apache warriors. It's a kindness, really, putting them out of their misery before they can grow up to scalp decent folk. Thomas forced his expression to remain neutral, though Jake's casual cruelty made his stomach churn. Seems like a lot of money for the army to be throwing around. Shows how serious they are about ending this thing once and for all. Colonel says they're gonna starve the savages out of the mountains this winter. No more Mr. Nice Guy, no more treaties. Just bullets and empty bellies until they surrender or die. After Jake left, Thomas sat alone on his porch as darkness fell, thinking about the $50 bounty on Citlali's head. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, and she'd looked so young lying unconscious by the dried creek. Somewhere out there, men were sharpening knives and loading rifles, dreaming of the money they could make from her death. On the third day, Thomas made his final preparations. If he was going to do this, if he was going to risk everything on a leap of faith, he needed to be smart about it. He spent the morning moving his most valuable possessions into a hidden root cellar he'd dug beneath his barn. His late wife's jewelry, their wedding photograph, the deed to his land, and what little money he'd saved went into a waterproof case and disappeared underground. He also wrote 2 letters. The first was to his brother Michael back in Ohio, explaining what he'd done and why, asking Michael to take over the ranch if something happened to him. The second was shorter, addressed to whoever might find it, simply stating that any help he'd given to Apache families was his choice alone, and that no coercion or threats had been involved. As the sun began to set on the third day, Thomas stood in his yard with the black stone Chief Nailnish had given him clutched in his palm. He'd made his decision sometime during the sleepless hours of the previous night, but he still felt his heart hammering as he waited for the Apache leader to appear. This time, Nailnish didn't come alone. 2 other men materialized from the gathering shadows, both younger but bearing the same dignified bearing as their chief. One Thomas recognized as bearing a strong resemblance to Ayanna and Citlali. He had to be their brother. The other was a stranger, but the way he carried himself suggested he was a war leader of some importance. "You have considered my offer," Nailnish said without preamble. "I have." "And?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I agree to help. But we need to establish some ground rules that will keep us all alive." Nailnish nodded to his companions, and the younger man who looked like Ayanna stepped forward. "I am Chaitin," he said in careful English. "Brother to those you saved. I speak for War Council." "And I'm a Higa," the other man added. "I hunt for the people. I know mountains, know safe paths." Thomas realized he was being introduced to key members of Chief Nailnish's inner circle. This wasn't just a desperate plea for help, it was a formal negotiation between leaders. "First rule," Thomas said. "No raids can be staged from my property. If your warriors attack settlers or soldiers and, then, come here for sanctuary, it puts us all at risk." "Agreed," Nailnish said immediately. "We fight, but not from your land. Your land is neutral ground." Second rule. I can't feed everyone indefinitely. We're talking about survival rations, not comfort. People might still be hungry, but they won't starve. "Hungry is better than dead," Ahiga said grimly.
Third rule, and this is the most important one, this has to remain secret. If word gets out, the army will come for all of us. I'll be hanged as a traitor, and your people will be slaughtered.
How do we hide presence of 37 people? Chayton asked.
Smoke from fires, tracks in snow, smell of cooking, these things cannot be hidden completely. Thomas had been thinking about this problem for 3 days. There's a canyon about 2 miles north of here. It's hidden from the main trails, has a spring for water, and the rock formations would hide smoke.
Your people could camp there.
I'd bring supplies regularly, but they'd stay out of sight. Nailnish looked at his advisors, and they spoke rapidly in Apache for several minutes. Finally, the chief turned back to Thomas.
This canyon you speak of, we know it.
It is called Whispering Stones by our people. Sacred place where warriors go to seek visions. It is fitting that it should shelter us now.
There's one more thing, Thomas said. I want to be clear about what I expect in return.
The 3 Apache men tensed slightly.
Here it comes, their expressions seemed to say. Here's the real price.
I want your word that when spring comes, when this crisis passes, you'll help me find a way to make peace between our peoples.
Not just a ceasefire, but real peace.
A way for Apache and settlers to share this land without destroying each other. The request clearly surprised them. Chayton and Ahiga exchanged glances, but Nailnish studied Thomas's face intently. You truly believe this is possible? The chief asked.
I don't know.
But I know that what we're doing now isn't working. Your people are dying, my people are living in fear, and every day the hatred gets deeper.
There has to be another way.
Many have tried to make peace between our peoples, Nailnish said slowly.
All have failed.
Treaties are signed, then, broken when white men want more land. Promises are made, then, forgotten when politicians change.
Maybe those people weren't trying hard enough. Maybe they didn't understand what was really at stake.
Ahiga stepped forward, his expression skeptical.
What do you know of Apache ways?
What do you know of sacred places, of ceremonies that have been performed for 1,000 winters? How can man who has lived here only 3 years speak of sharing land he does not truly understand?
It was a fair challenge, and Thomas knew it.
You're right.
I don't understand your ways. But I want to learn.
And, in exchange, I can help you understand how white settlers think, what drives them, what they fear.
Maybe understanding is the first step toward peace.
The 3 men spoke in Apache again, their voices rising and falling in animated discussion. Thomas caught a few words he recognized. Ayana and Seetlali's names came up several times, as did what sounded like arguments about trust and risk. Finally, Nailnish raised his hand for silence.
We will try your plan, he announced.
But, know this, Thomas Mackenzie, when spring comes, if you have not found way to make true peace, my people will have no choice but to return to warpath.
We cannot hide in caves forever. I understand. Do you? Because if peace cannot be made, you will be seen as enemy again.
The kindness you show now will not protect you then.
Thomas nodded grimly.
He was betting everything on his ability to find a solution that had eluded military leaders, government officials, and tribal elders for decades. If he failed, he'd likely die along with every Apache who had trusted him. When do we start? He asked.
Tomorrow, Nailnish replied. We bring families to Whispering Stones Canyon tomorrow night.
You bring first supplies day after. As the Apache men prepared to leave, Chayton approached Thomas with something wrapped in deerskin. From my sisters, he said simply. Thomas unwrapped the package to find a pair of moccasins, beautifully crafted and decorated with intricate beadwork. They looked like they'd fit him perfectly. They work many days on these, Chayton explained. They say white man's boots make too much noise when he walks. These will help you move like Apache when you bring supplies. The gift touched Thomas deeply. In the midst of all their own troubles, Ayana and Seetlali had taken time to make him something beautiful and practical. Please thank them for me, he said.
Thank them yourself, Nailnish said.
They come with families to Canyon.
You will see them again.
After the Apache men disappeared into the darkness, Thomas went inside and prepared for what might be his last night alone in the house he'd shared with Sarah. Tomorrow, he'd begin a journey that would either make him a bridge between two worlds or get him killed trying. He spent the evening gathering supplies he could spare without arousing suspicion if neighbors visited. Dried beans, cornmeal, some preserved meat, a few blankets that had belonged to Sarah. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he lay in bed that night, Thomas thought about the moccasins Ayana and Lali had made for him. The sisters had remembered him, had taken time to create something that would help him in his mission. It was a reminder that on the other side of this conflict were people who loved, who hoped, who created beautiful things even in the midst of desperation. Tomorrow, he'd begin walking a path that no white man in the territory had ever attempted. He'd become the secret lifeline for an Apache band, the bridge between two peoples who seemed destined to destroy each other. He'd risk his life on the belief that understanding could triumph over fear, that compassion could be stronger than hatred. But tonight, he was still just Thomas Mackenzie, a rancher who missed his wife and worried about his cattle and wondered if he was brave enough to do what needed to be done. The moccasin sat on his dresser, waiting for him to become the man Ayana and Lali believed he could be. The first month of the arrangement nearly killed Thomas, both from exhaustion and fear. Every other day, he'd load his pack mule with supplies and make the treacherous journey to Whispering Stones Canyon, timing his trips to avoid the army patrols that had increased dramatically as winter approached. The moccasins Ayana and Lali had made proved invaluable. They allowed him to move silently through the rocky terrain and left tracks that looked more like animal prints than boot marks. The canyon itself was a marvel of natural fortification. Narrow entrance passages twisted between towering rock walls, opening into a hidden valley about the size of 2 football fields. A clear spring bubbled up from underground, feeding a small stream that disappeared back into the rocks at the far end. Natural caves and overhangs provided shelter, while the surrounding cliffs made the camp invisible from any distance. Chief Nailnish had been right when he called it sacred ground. The rock walls were covered with ancient pictographs, painted images of hunters and animals, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight, and symbols that spoke of ceremonies performed here for countless generations. Thomas felt like an intruder every time he entered, despite the warm welcome he received from the Apache families. The people themselves surprised him daily. He'd expected to find a ragtag band of desperate refugees, but what he discovered was a functioning community that had simply been forced underground. The elders maintained their role as keepers of tradition and wisdom. The women continued their crafts, creating beautiful pottery and jewelry even with limited materials. The children played games and learned lessons, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls despite their circumstances. Ayana and Lali had indeed come with the group, and Thomas found himself looking forward to his conversations with them perhaps more than he should have. Ayana, in particular, had an insatiable curiosity about the white world. She asked him about books, about machines, about the cities back east that she'd heard described but never seen. In return, she taught him Apache words and customs, helping him understand the deep spiritual connection her people felt to the land. "Your people, they see land as thing to own," she explained one evening as they sat by the sacred spring. "Like horse or rifle. Something to buy and sell." "How do your people see it?" Thomas asked. "Land is not owned. Land is, how you say, mother. You do not own your mother. You are part of her, and she is part of you. You take care of her, and she takes care of you." It was a fundamental difference in worldview that explained much of the conflict between their peoples. Thomas was beginning to understand that the Apache weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting for their very identity, their spiritual connection to the landscape that defined who they were. But understanding didn't make his dual life any easier. During the day, he played the role of a struggling rancher, commiserating with neighbors about Apache raids and nodding along when they talked about the need for more aggressive military action. The deception ate at him, especially when Jake Morrison or other friends spoke casually about tracking down and killing the very people Thomas had shared a meal with the night before. The physical demands were also taking their toll. Thomas was losing weight from giving away too much of his own food, and the constant stress of maintaining his secret was giving him headaches and sleepless nights. Twice he'd nearly been caught by army patrols, once having to hide in a cave for 6 hours while soldiers camped directly above the canyon entrance. But the most challenging part was watching the Apache children grow thinner despite his efforts. His supplies helped, but they weren't enough to fully sustain 37 people through a harsh winter. The children never complained, but Thomas could see the hunger in their eyes, the way they'd save half their food for later, not knowing when the next meal might come. It was during his 6th week of supply runs that everything nearly fell apart. Thomas had just finished unloading a particularly large shipment of food, corn, beans, some precious medicine he'd obtained from the town doctor under the pretense of treating sick cattle when one of the Apache scouts came running into camp. "Soldiers," the young man gasped in Apache, pointing toward the canyon entrance. "Many soldiers. They search for our trail." Chief Nailnish immediately began issuing orders in rapid Apache. Fires were extinguished, cooking pots hidden, children gathered into the deepest caves. The entire camp of nearly 40 people seemed to vanish in minutes, leaving no trace of their presence except for the pack mule Thomas had brought. "You must go," Nailnish told Thomas urgently. "Take different path, circle around. If they find you here." "What about you? What about your people?" "We hide. We are good at hiding." "But, you white man in Apache camp." "No explanation for that except truth." Thomas knew the chief was right, but leaving felt like abandonment. These people had trusted him, and now soldiers were closing in while he ran to safety. "There's another way," Thomas said suddenly. "I have an idea, but you have to trust me." Before Nailnish could object, Thomas began unpacking the supplies he'd brought, scattering them around the canyon floor. He pulled food out of containers, scattered grain on the ground, and generally made the area look like animals had gotten into stored supplies. "What are you doing?" Ayana whispered from the cave entrance where she was hidden. "Making this look like a food cache that got raided by bears or coyotes," Thomas replied, working frantically. "If the soldiers find tracks leading here, they'll think animals scattered the food, not people." It was a desperate gambit, but it was all he had. As the sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls, Thomas grabbed his rifle and positioned himself behind some rocks near the scattered supplies. When the soldiers appeared, he'd act like a frustrated rancher tracking the animals that had destroyed his hidden food stores. The first soldier to enter the canyon was a young lieutenant Thomas didn't recognize, followed by a sergeant and 4 enlisted men. They rode carefully, eyes scanning the rocks above for signs of ambush. Thomas waited until they were well into the canyon, then stood up from behind his rocks, making sure to look startled and annoyed. "Well, hell," he said loudly. "You boys scared me half to death. Thought you might be more of the varmints that tore up my supplies." The lieutenant's hand moved to his pistol, then relaxed when he recognized Thomas as a white settler. "Mr. Mackenzie, isn't it? What are you doing here?" "Tracking the damn bears that got into my winter food cache," Thomas replied, gesturing at the scattered supplies around him. "Been hiding food here for months, planning to come back for it when I needed it. Found it like this 2 days ago." The sergeant dismounted and examined the scene more closely. Thomas held his breath as the man studied the ground, looking for signs that would contradict the story. "Definitely bear sign," the sergeant announced finally. "See the claw marks on that grain sack? And there's scat over by that rock." Thomas nearly sagged with relief. The Apache had been hiding food in this canyon for weeks, and apparently some of it really had attracted scavengers. "You see any signs of Apache in this area?" the lieutenant asked. "Not recently," Thomas replied truthfully. "Though I'll tell you, after losing all this food, I'm tempted to shoot any Indian I see just on principle." The soldiers spent another 20 minutes searching the canyon, but they found exactly what Thomas had intended them to find: evidence of animal activity and a frustrated rancher dealing with the aftermath. As they prepared to leave, the lieutenant offered some advice. "Might want to find a better hiding spot for your supplies," he said. "Word is there's a big Apache band somewhere in these mountains. Last thing you want is them finding your food cache instead of bears." After the soldiers disappeared, Thomas waited a full hour before calling softly into the caves. Slowly, the Apache families emerged from their hiding places, led by Chief Nailnish. "That was very dangerous thing you did," the chief said. "It worked,"
didn't it? This time. But soldiers will be back. They know we are somewhere near.
Nailnish was right. Over the next few days, army patrols increased dramatically. Thomas had to cancel 2 supply runs because of the military presence, and, when he did finally make it to the canyon, he found the Apache families preparing to move to an even more remote location.
"Where will you go?" Thomas asked Ayanna as she packed the few possessions she'd been able to carry. "Higher into mountains.
There are caves there, but no water, no shelter from wind. It will be harder, but safer from soldiers. I can still bring supplies, but it'll be more difficult."
"No." Chief Nailnish approached them, his expression grave. "Too dangerous now.
Soldiers watch everything.
We must survive on our own." Thomas looked around at the children, at the elderly Apache who were already struggling with the cold. "You can't survive up there without help. Not with winter getting worse." "We have survived worse things," Nailnish replied. "Our ancestors endured hardships you cannot imagine. We will endure this too."
But Thomas could see the doubt in the chief's eyes, could hear the hollow confidence in his voice. They were putting on a brave face, but everyone knew that moving higher into the mountains in the middle of winter was likely a death sentence for the weakest members of the group. That night, as Thomas prepared to leave what might be his final visit to the canyon, Ayanna approached him with a bundle of furs. "For your warmth," she said simply. "You have given much to my people. This is small thanks. Ayanna, I need to ask you something." She looked up at him, waiting. "If things get desperate up in those mountains, if people start dying from cold or hunger, will you send word to me? Will you let me help, even if your father forbids it?" Her dark eyes searched his face for a long moment. "Why you risk so much for people you barely know?" "Because they're not just people anymore. They're individuals. I know old Tahoma's stories about hunting elk in the high country. I know little Kaya's laugh when she plays with her doll. I know that Seat Lolly hums while she works, and that you dream of seeing the ocean someday. You're not enemies anymore. You're..." "What?" Thomas hesitated, then spoke the truth. "Your family." Ayanna stepped closer to him, and, for a moment he thought she might touch his face. Instead, she pressed something small into his hand, another carved stone, this one white instead of black. "If we need you," she said quietly, "someone will leave this stone at the old oak tree by your eastern fence. Check there every few days. And, if I need to reach you? Same place. We watch. We always watch." As Thomas made his way back to his ranch through the bitter cold night, he realized that his simple act of giving water to 2 dying women had transformed into something he'd never expected. He wasn't just helping strangers anymore, he was deeply, personally invested in the survival of this Apache band. Somewhere along the way, Ayanna had become more than just Chief Nailnish's daughter. She'd become someone whose welfare mattered to him in ways that went beyond simple humanitarian concern. The thought should have frightened him. He was a white rancher developing feelings for an Apache woman in the middle of a brutal conflict between their peoples. But, instead of fear, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Winter was deepening, the army patrols were increasing, and 37 Apache people were about to face the worst conditions imaginable. But Thomas Mackenzie had made his choice months ago when he'd knelt beside 2 dying women and offered them water. Whatever came next, he'd face it knowing he'd chosen compassion over comfort, understanding over ignorance, love over fear. The white stone in his pocket felt warm against his fingers as he approached his lonely ranch house, and he found himself checking the eastern fence every day, waiting for a sign that his help was needed once again. The white stone appeared at the old oak tree on a frigid February morning, nearly 3 months after the Apache band had retreated into the high mountains. Thomas had checked the spot religiously every few days, even when snow made the trek difficult, and seeing the small carved marker nestled in the tree's roots made his heart both leap and sink. They needed him, which meant things had gotten desperate. Thomas prepared carefully for what might be his most dangerous mission yet. The Army's winter patrols had decreased due to the harsh weather, but the risk remained significant. He loaded his strongest horse with medicine, warm clothing, and what food he could spare, then set out before dawn toward the high country where the Apache band had sought refuge. The journey took most of the day, following treacherous mountain paths that were barely visible under the snow. Several times Thomas nearly turned back, convinced he was lost, but each time he found subtle trail markers, scratches on rocks, bent branches that guided him higher into the peaks. He found them just as the sun was setting, camped in a cluster of caves that offered protection from the wind but little else. The sight that greeted him nearly broke his heart. The Apache band that had once numbered 37 was now visibly reduced. Several of the elderly had died during the harsh winter, and those who remained looked gaunt and exhausted. The children were bundled in every scrap of clothing and, for the adults could find, but their faces were pale with cold and hunger. Chief Nailnish emerged from the largest cave, and Thomas was shocked by how much the proud leader had aged. His hair had gone completely gray, and his movements spoke of a man carrying burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. "You came," was all the chief said, but those two words carried the weight of profound gratitude. "How bad is it?" Thomas asked. "We lost 8 people to the cold and sickness. 3 more will not live to see spring." Thomas felt the number like a physical blow. 8 people dead because he hadn't been able to do more, because the conflict between their peoples had forced them into conditions no one should have to endure. "Where are Ayana and Seedlali?" "Seedlali is very sick. Lung fever. Ayana tends her." Thomas immediately began unpacking his supplies, pulling out the precious medicines he'd managed to obtain. As he worked, Apache families began emerging from their caves, drawn by the hope that help had finally arrived. The reunion was bittersweet. Thomas saw familiar faces made thin by hardship, children who had grown taller but thinner during their months in hiding. But he also noticed faces that were missing, people who had been part of the community in Whispering Stones Canyon but who would never laugh or tell stories again. Ayana appeared from one of the caves, and Thomas was relieved to see that she, at least, looked relatively healthy despite the obvious stress and exhaustion. She approached him with tears in her eyes. "You should not have come," she said. "Too dangerous. But we are grateful you did. How is Seedlali?" "Very sick. She burns with fever, cannot breathe well. I think." Ayana's voice broke. "I think maybe she dies soon." Thomas grabbed the medicine pack from his supplies. "Take me to her." The cave where Seedlali lay was barely large enough for 2 people. The young woman who had once been so vibrant was now a shadow of herself, her breathing labored and her skin burning with fever. But when she saw Thomas, she managed a weak smile. "White brother," she whispered in English, using a phrase that surprised him. "You come back to us." Thomas knelt beside her makeshift bed and began preparing the medicine he'd brought. "I'm going to help you get better," he said, though privately he worried that the lung fever might be too advanced for the crude remedies available to him. For the next 3 days, Thomas remained in the Apache camp, doing everything he could to help. He distributed food and warm clothing, treated the sick with what medicine he had, and worked alongside the Apache men to improve their shelters against the continuing cold. But it was his time spent with Seedlali that would prove most significant. As he sat with her during the long nights, helping her fight the fever, she spoke to him about things that would change his understanding of the entire situation. "Thomas," she said during one of her more lucid moments, "there is something you must know about my father's plans." "What do you mean?" "He has been in contact with other chiefs. When spring comes, they plan great war council. All Apache bands will unite for final push against white settlements." Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. "How many warriors are we talking about?" "Perhaps 300. Maybe more. They plan to drive all whites from Apache lands or die trying." The implications were staggering. If Chief Nailnish was coordinating with other Apache leaders for a massive spring offensive, the territory would be plunged into the bloodiest conflict in its history. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people would die on both sides. "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked. Seedlali's fever-bright eyes focused on his face. "Because I think there is another way. And because my sister, she cares for you more than is wise." Thomas glanced toward the cave entrance, where Ayanna was visible tending to other sick members of their band.
What do you mean? She speaks of you constantly.
Dreams of different world where Apache and whites live in peace. She thinks maybe you are a man who can make this dream real.
Your sister is a remarkable woman, but I'm just a rancher. I can't stop a war. Maybe you can. But only if you're willing to risk everything.
Seedlali then revealed something that changed everything. Chief Nailnish had been secretly hoping that Thomas would find a way to arrange a real peace negotiation. The chief's war preparations weren't just military strategy, they were also negotiating tactics. If the Apache could demonstrate their ability to inflict massive casualties, the government might finally be willing to discuss genuine terms rather than simply demanding unconditional surrender.
He wants peace, Seedlali explained, but he knows white government only respects strength.
So he prepares for war to make peace possible. That night, Thomas had a long conversation with Chief Nailnish around a small, carefully concealed fire. The Apache leader confirmed what Seedlali had told him. "I am tired of war," Nailnish admitted. "Tired of watching my people die from bullets and cold and hunger. But I will not lead them to reservation to die slowly like cattle."
There must be third choice. What if I could arrange a meeting? Thomas asked.
Not with the army, but with territorial officials. People who might have authority to negotiate real terms.
What terms could white government offer that they have not already broken? It was a fair question.
Treaty after treaty had been signed and violated, promises made and discarded when politically convenient.
Why should this time be any different?
Because this time, you'd have an advocate who understands both sides, Thomas said. Someone who's lived with your people, who knows your true nature, who can speak to white officials about what's really at stake. Nailnish studied Thomas for a long moment.
You would do this? Speak for Apache people to your own government? Even knowing they might call you traitor?
If it prevents a war that will destroy both our peoples, yes. The chief was quiet for several minutes, staring into the fire.
There is great risk in what you propose. If peace talks fail, war becomes inevitable.
And if war comes after failed peace talks, it will be bloodier than anything we have seen.
And if we don't try? What then?
Then, we fight until one side or other is extinct.
The next morning, Seedlali's fever finally broke.
As she slept peacefully for the first time in days, Thomas prepared to leave the mountain camp. He'd made a decision that would determine the fate of everyone he'd come to care about. But, before he left, Ayanna approached him with a request that would make his mission even more complicated.
"I want to come with you," she said.
"What?" "To peace talks, if you can arrange them. Apache need representative who can speak for our people. Someone who understands both worlds."
Thomas stared at her, understanding the magnitude of what she was proposing.
"Ayanna, if you come down from these mountains, you'll be seen as a fugitive.
The army has bounties on Apache, remember?
It would be incredibly dangerous."
"Everything is dangerous now. But maybe this danger leads to something better." Chief Nailnish approached them, having overheard the conversation.
"She is right," he said. "If white officials are to understand Apache position, they must hear it from Apache voice, not just white advocate." "But the risk." "I have made decision," Nailnish said firmly.
"Ayanna will go with you.
She will speak for our people. And if she dies in this attempt, it will be no different than dying in war, except her death might serve peace instead of violence." 3 days later, Thomas and Ayanna rode down from the high country toward the territorial capital, carrying with them the hopes and fears of two peoples balanced on the edge of catastrophic war. The young Apache woman rode beside him dressed in clothing that would help her pass for Mexican rather than Apache, her hair braided in a different style, her weapons hidden beneath a long coat Thomas had provided. As they traveled, Thomas found himself acutely aware of the woman beside him. Ayanna was beautiful, intelligent, brave, and completely committed to her people's welfare. Under different circumstances, in a different world, he might have found the courage to tell her how he felt about her. But they were living in a world where such feelings could get them both killed.
Thomas, Ayana said as they made camp their first night away from the mountains, if peace talks fail, what happens to us? To this friendship we have built? He looked at her across their small campfire, seeing in her face all the complexity of their impossible situation. I don't know, he admitted. I hope we never have to find out. And, if they succeed? If somehow we make peace between our peoples? Then, maybe we'll have helped create a world where friendship between Apache and whites is possible. What Thomas didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that he was no longer just fighting for peace between their peoples. He was fighting for the possibility of a future where he and Ayana could explore what had grown between them without betraying everything they believed in. The territorial capital was 3 days away, and, waiting there were government officials who would decide whether Thomas Mackenzie's desperate gambit could prevent a war, or whether his efforts would simply be the prologue to the bloodiest conflict in Arizona's history. Chief Nailnish had given him one final message to convey: tell them that Apache people are willing to share this land with whites, but we will not be driven from it. Tell them that spring will bring either peace or war, but the choice is theirs to make. As Thomas and Ayana rode toward their uncertain destiny, the humble rancher who had once only wanted to tend his cattle and honor his wife's memory realized he had become something he'd never expected, a bridge between two worlds, carrying the weight of both people's futures on his shoulders. The choice that had begun with offering water to 2 dying women was about to determine whether those worlds would finally learn to coexist, or whether they would destroy each other in the attempt.